In this video, we're going to give a brief overview of the VLAN trunking protocol. Now, in my opinion, VTP is misnamed. It doesn't actually have anything to do with trunking itself. All the VLAN trunking protocol does is synchronize the VLAN configurations between switches. Now, actually, there is another protocol that configures VLAN trunks between switches. It is called DTP, or the Dynamic Trunking Protocol. However, for the CCNA, you don't ever get into DTP. You'll end up seeing it a little bit in our lab once we go and set up all of these VLAN trunks, but you don't really have to know anything about DTP or the dynamic protocols that control trunking itself for the CCNA. Now, unlike some of the other protocols, VTP communicates between switches on trunk ports. So if you connect one switch to another and you don't configure those ports as trunks, or if DTP doesn't take over and make them trunks for you, then VTP will not work across that port. And really, the whole point of VTP is to keep the administrator, i.e. us, from having to configure the same VLANs on every switch on the network. Obviously, configuring VLANs on every switch is not a big deal if you only have 1 or 2 or 5 switches. But if you've got 50 switches spread out across 5 locations and you want to add a VLAN to all 50 switches, you can see that you'd be spending a lot of time logging into each switch and issuing the same VLAN commands. And yes, there are third-party products like Cisco Works and some of the other configuration management tools that can assist in pushing these commands out to the switch. But still, you have to actually go to every switch and configure it one way or another. If you have VTP set up and it's set up correctly, you enter the VLAN information on one of your server switches, and we'll get into those roles here in a bit, and the VLAN information is synchronized out to all of the rest of the switches on your network. However, as with many things in networking, with great power comes great responsibility. If you're not careful with your VTP configuration, you can kill every VLAN on your network with one misconfigured switch. And in the next video, where we talk about the specifics of how VTP actually works and how it communicates, I'll show you a scenario where that could happen. Now, when you configure VTP, there are 4 parameters that are set. The first is the VTP domain name. The VTP domain name is a case-sensitive string that identifies the group of switches that will be configured via VTP. Each switch can belong to one and only one VTP domain. However, you can have multiple VTP domains on the same LAN if you so desired. To be perfectly honest, I can't think of a situation where you would want to have multiple VTP domains, but then again, most of the time I don't run VTP because I consider it to be a little dangerous for the purposes of most of the networks I put together. The next thing that's configured is the VTP password. The VTP password is actually optional, but it is recommended if you use VTP in the first place, so that a misconfigured switch, again, will not kill your entire network. The VTP password is an optional but recommended case-sensitive string that authenticates the VTP messages. This way, you couldn't have a rogue attacker come in and attach a switch to your network, sniff out your VTP domain name, and then proceed to synchronize out a bad or faulty VTP database to the rest of the LAN. The third parameter is the VTP mode, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. And the fourth is the VTP version, and again, we'll talk about that here on the next slide. Now, there are 3 VTP modes for any given switch. The first is the server. The server is allowed to make changes to the VLAN database and VTP parameters. You have the client. The client is not allowed to make changes to the VLAN database. It only receives configurations from the server. And last, you have transparent. Transparent VTP mode pretty much ignores VTP messages. Setting a switch to VTP transparent mode is the closest you can get to actually disabling VTP. In an iOS-based switch, you cannot disable VTP. If you happen to have an ancient switch that still runs CatOS, you can actually turn it off, but those switches are very difficult to find in a production network because they are so old. And last but not least, we'll talk about the 3 versions of VTP. There are actually 3 versions of VTP. Most modern switches only support 2 versions of VTP, and you really only need to know about versions 1 and 2 for the exam. The major difference, and pretty much the only difference between version 1 and version 2, is that version 2 supports token ring. So for most situations, version 1 will work fine. There are a few minor differences between version 1 and version 2 that we'll get into on the next video, but honestly they're so minor as to be pretty inconsequential. So we'll get into that next, but for now, that concludes our overview of the VLAN trunking protocol.